My name is Malcolm McLaughlin. I'm the Public Information Coordinator here at the Sacramento Public Library, and I'm here with Ari Graswich, who has a new book out from the I Street Press, Vagrant Kings. It's a history of the Sacramento Kings professional basketball team, Kevin Johnson, and how they ended up staying in Sacramento. So let's dive right in. What inspired you to write this book, and are there any main points that you'd like readers to take away from it?
Well, yes and yes. Malcolm, thanks for having me, number one. What inspired me was 30 years, really, of hanging around the Sacramento Kings. You know, I started off with the team as a reporter at the Sacramento Bee. I started covering the team when they were still in Kansas City, back in 1984. The Bee was gearing up for the move. They had a number of us reporting on the team, and I was part of that coverage. I then became the beat writer for the Kings, covered them as a columnist.
What period were you the beat writer?
I was the beat writer I was the backup beat writer 85 to 87, and then the lead beat writer 87 to 92, and then I moved to a column and covered them as a columnist. Really up until 2007, even though I moved to the news side for the last 10 years or so. You know, the Kings have been such a big story in Sacramento. You can't really work as a journalist in Sacramento and not cross paths with the Kings at some point. And since they were a part of my history, I was always drawn to them whenever it was a slow news day.
And you got some of the best years in there too as a columnist.
Yeah, I mean, every year was a rollicking time with the Sacramento Kings. But it's funny because back even in the 80s, I thought, this is going to be a book someday. This is such a great story. It'll be a book someday. I never got around to writing it up until 2013. This year, I'd been with the mayor's office for almost 4 years till the end, just about the end of 2012. And I decided, now's the time. I've got all the information. I spent some time inside. I helped work on the arena project with the mayor the last couple of years. Let's write the book. So I wrote the book, and really the takeaway for the reader to me is that there's a couple takeaways. Number one, it's a story about looking for a home, redemption. This team has been kicked around by every city, half the cities in America, it seems. They've come from Rochester to Cincinnati to Kansas City to Omaha. They have bounced around more than any pro team in the history of American Major League sports, any sport. And here they found a home. And there are some people trying to take them away still, and I thought, what a story. And I began my research back in January of 13, and I realized that nobody had ever written this. No one's pulled the story together. So it's an original story about a fascinating team that dates back to the Depression, and it's time to tell it.
Well, and a lot of us who live here and who are, maybe more casual sports fans are certainly aware of the Kings, that they might go to Seattle, a lot of the controversy with the Maloof brothers. What is, something that, someone like me who has, a definite awareness of the story but maybe doesn't know it in depth, what is something that would really kind of surprise us or is a big misconception about the story of the Kings, especially in recent years?
It's a fascinating question because the answer is the story of the Sacramento Kings has almost nothing to do with basketball. It has to do with politics. It has to do with land use. It has to do with business. It has to do with commodities. It has to do with selling peanuts and selling hot dogs. It has to do with everything except basketball. And you find this as the team moves across the country. This goes back to the 1950s. In Cincinnati, they were purchased for the reason the owner, the guy owned the arena in Cincinnati, Cincinnati Gardens. And he wanted to sell peanuts. He didn't care what happened to the basketball team. Didn't care one way or the other about it. He just wanted to fill dates in his arena. And that was really the downfall of the Sacramento Kings, I think. Oscar Robertson speaks about this in his autobiography. What happened after that, they became basically a commodity. They were owned for reasons that had very little to do with basketball. Joe Benvenuti, the guy who financed the move to Sacramento, he was a land developer here. He'd never seen a pro basketball game before he bought the Sacramento Kings. Never bothered to see one. He bought it so he could get North Natomas, the land around today, which is known as Sleep Train Arena, rezoned from agriculture. He wanted it turned into, he wanted the rezoning process sped up, essentially. So that's the story of the Sacramento Kings, is how they've been used and abused, you could say, for everything under the sun other than basketball, and maybe that's why they have had such a tough time on the basketball court.
Well, actually, just so people know, let's go through the list of cities. and the approximate years, because I wasn't actually aware that, I mean, they were one of the original 8 NBA teams before there even was an NBA. Their history goes back as long as the Lakers and the Celtics.
Yeah, yeah. They began life as a barnstorming team in Rochester, New York, Western New York. In those days, there weren't pro leagues. The college game was popular. High school basketball was popular. The pro game was kind of a dark, sort of a bloody boxing, wrestling type of game. It was not. They used to put cages up around pro basketball arenas in cities because they encouraged the crowd to throw things at the players, and I mean, it was a rough sport in those days. The pro game was. So the most prestigious team in America was the Harlem Globetrotters, if you can imagine that. So they were barnstormers, these guys, and they went around. They played these pickup games, basically, just to give folks something to do during the Depression. That's how the Rochester Royals, as they were known then, that's how they began. They actually had, the fellow who founded them was named Les Harrison, and he was a great basketball player himself as a high schooler, smart businessman, made money on the team, and he actually had one of the best teams in America. He put together a real good team. So as leagues began to form, he then he was asked to join the leagues, did join one of these preceders, the leagues that came before the NBA. He joined one of them, then moved to another one. There were actually 3 of them. Was there in 1949 when the NBA was founded, and was one of the top owners and top teams when the NBA was founded. He was at the table that day at the Empire State Building when they founded the NBA. So they've had this wonderful history, really. They won their championship in 1951, a couple years after the NBA was formed. They were far and away, if not the best team in the NBA, one of the best. They beat the New York Knicks that year. They were a great team. And then they started to lose. What happened was Harrison, a couple things happened. Harrison didn't update his team. He had the same old players, and they kept getting older, and they slowed down like we tend to do.
Happens very fast.
Happens, right. He didn't change his playing style. The styles were changing. He didn't do that. Began to lose. People started watching television, which of course was unheard of in the 30s. The country was changing, and Les didn't change with them.
And they moved, Kansas City, Omaha?
Well, first they went to Cincinnati.
Okay.
He had to find a place. He wasn't selling any tickets in Rochester, so he moves to Cincinnati, which was a much bigger city. Then they have a new arena there. But they really don't sell many tickets there either. So he's struggling there. He gets discouraged and leaves, and he sells to this fellow by the name of Louis Jacobs. Jacobs is the guy who owned the arena and who wanted to sell peanuts. He also had mob connections. He got himself in trouble with the federal government because of money he was investing with Jimmy Hoffa in Las Vegas. His company was indicted and convicted of some racketeering business in the 70s. He was forced to sell the team because of that. He was bringing too much negative attention to the NBA. He sells the team to a group in Kansas City. So they go to Kansas City. And by this point, they're pretty well a bad team.
So it's not only had a lot of cities, it's had a lot of owners.
A lot of owners, a lot of cities, a lot of owners, and they've always been cheap. It's been one of those things where if you need a team for whatever reason, whether it's your ego or whether it's to sell peanuts or whether it's to get some land rezoned, you can buy the Sacramento Kings or the Kansas City Kings or the Cincinnati Royals because they're cheap. And that's what happened. They end up in Kansas City. They're playing in 2 cities actually, Omaha and Kansas City. That didn't work out so well. And they're just, and the NBA at this point had really sunk to arguably a low point in the early 80s. You had there's a great quote in the book. We mentioned one of the NBA executives said, I would be selling sponsorships to major corporations, and if I had a half-hour meeting, the first 20 minutes would be explaining that all the players are not on drugs. That was a perception in the early 80s.
Well, no, I think people don't have the idea of how low the NBA had sunk before Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and then eventually Michael Jordan sort of gave it some real star power again and kind of brought it back up.
Exactly, and that was David Stern. David Stern was David Stern joined the league. This was another interesting coincidence I thought. Stern joined the league in 1966. People don't realize he'd been there that long. Joined the league in '66, the same year Kevin Johnson was born. Stern's an outside attorney at that point, advising the league. Then they hire him as an inside counsel, and so he's advising. And then come the '80s. He's now the guy that saves the league from the problems that you just described as the league's chief marketing guy. He became the marketing guy just as Larry Bird and Magic Johnson and of course Michael Jordan come along. And then in '84, the same year Jordan joins the league, Stern is elevated to commissioner. And then things take off.
Well, speaking of Kevin Johnson, let's fast forward a little bit to the very complex relationship of Sacramento mayor, Sacramento native Kevin Johnson, and the Sacramento Kings. I mean, there's some history from long before he was mayor, and then he's really made keeping the Kings, a major cause, if not the major cause, along with education, of his time as mayor.
It's become his legacy. You're absolutely right. And what's interesting is, and this caused some controversy when I first wrote about this, is Kevin doesn't like the Kings. In fact, I use the word hated the Kings, and he did, and I believe to some degree, in some way, still does, for a very good reason. Back when he was a graduating well, not quite graduating, because he did graduate from Cal, but a little later. So he's a senior leaving Cal. He's up for the NBA draft. He would love nothing more than to be drafted by his hometown team, the Sacramento Kings. Remember, this is 1987. They've been here 2 years. And he's one of the top players in the country, right? And he's the best player by far to come out of Sacramento. What do the Sacramento Kings do? They ignore him. They draft a guy who's just like him, Kenny Smith, who's a point guard, same size, same dimension, same position, only out of Michael Jordan's school, North Carolina. So they draft Kenny Smith, and they leave Kevin Johnson high and dry. From that moment on, I mean, this is devastating to Kevin Johnson. Not surprisingly, right?
Well, and Kenny Smith had a good career, but Johnson had a much better career.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say that around Kevin Johnson.
Well, maybe even an okay career. And Johnson had a great career.
Yeah, and Kenny won a couple of rings, actually. He ended up with the Houston Rockets and helped them win a couple championships as a backup. And then, of course, now he has a television career. So Kenny did fine, but Kevin did great. And it turned out, one of the luckiest thing that ever happened to Kevin Johnson, I believe, was that he wasn't drafted by the Sacramento Kings. He gets drafted by the Cleveland Cavaliers. They trade him less than a year later. He ends up with the Phoenix Suns, and a 3 years later, he's in the playing for the NBA championships. The rest is history, So, but that stuck with Kevin, and to this day, even as mayor, he's made these comments not only to me but to anybody, a lot of staff members and all that. Whenever the Kings would do something really stupid, he would say, they're still the same team that drafted Kenny Smith with the number 6 draft pick. And again, I can't blame him for that. I mean, it was a tough day for him, even though it all worked out great so many years later. So yeah, he's never liked them for the reasons I explained, but he knows that Sacramento needs the Kings. He understands that, I think intuitively, as any mayor would. This community would be devastated if we lost our only major league team. That's why he's fought so hard to build the arena. And I think you have to kind of differentiate between the Kings and the arena if you can. Kevin's process has been all about the arena, and he's always said, it's bigger than the Kings. It ain't about the Kings. It's about our economic development downtown, etc. So that's important to remember. Kevin's never made the Kings his cause. He's always made the arena and economic development our cause, and that's an important distinction.
Well, and you've actually been hit with a little bit of criticism because you worked for Kevin Johnson. And then, combining that with your experience, years of covering the Kings, that kind of gives you 2 points that make you kind of uniquely qualified for writing this book. But then, some folks have sort of charged that you've traded on this inside access to the Johnson administration and some of the goings-on that have happened over the years. Would you like to respond to that?
Oh, you bet. And the answer is I indeed have traded on that, intentionally so. And here's why. Number one, I thought I was the best guy in a unique position. I'm the only person who's actually covered the team for a number of years, basically since before they got here, and had the opportunity to work inside on the arena plan as special assistant to Kevin Johnson. There's a couple of other things that I think people need to understand, though. Number one is that when I was special assistant, the public paid my salary. I worked for the people of Sacramento. I was a city employee. All of the conversations that I quote, all of the transcripts that I reprint, they were all acquired inside City Hall, which is a public building. So, and on top of that, Kevin Johnson and David Stern and all the conversations that are quoted are speaking about spending public money. They're not speaking about their own money, and they're not speaking about private issues or their families. They're talking about, here's how we spend public money to build an arena in Sacramento. So you've got the mayor in City Hall talking about spending public money, and some people have the nerve to tell me that that's off limits. I don't think so. The other thing is, the final point is that when I started with Kevin back in '09, the first conversation we had was about a book. So from '09 to the end of '12 when I left, he knew I was writing a book. I mean, we talked about a book a dozen times. Now, we never came to an agreement on how to do the book or what the book would be, but there's no secrets. I mean, there's no surprises about me writing a book. So those are the elements that I think, and I got to tell you finally here, when someone leaves politics, whether it's city politics or national politics, whatever, they write books. It's what people have done forever. So I don't see what the controversy is all about. I'd say to Sacramento, get used to it and enjoy the inside information here, because we're talking about you.
Okay, well, I want to come back to David Stone and some of the business stuff, but talk a little bit about working with the iStreet Press and then this model of releasing an ebook and then releasing a physical book on the iStreet Press.
Well, another great question, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about the iStreet Press. I'm doing everything backwards here. I've talked to agents and publishers, and they all said, well, you can't do it this way, you can't do it that way. They're telling me all these things I can't do. And so I finally decided, if you can't tell me what I can't do, I'm going to have to figure out what I can do. And given the fact that there is such a thing as Amazon today, there is such a thing as Apple, iTunes, and iBooks, and Nook today, I might be able to do something without the help of Simon & Schuster. I've got Amazon and Apple. Who needs Simon & Schuster, right? So I figured out the ebook part would be fairly easy to do myself, and I get a much better deal, by the way, dealing with them than I would if I dealt with Simon & Schuster. Not that there's anything wrong with Simon & Schuster, but the dollars are better on your own if you play it right. But I still wanted a physical book, right? So there's many options to do physical books. You can self-publish, you can have an aggregator, you can do all kinds of things, right? But I heard about the iStreet Press, which is a relatively new phenomenon, and I've been a great fan of the Sacramento Public Library for decades. I mean, I love the library. And to me, the light went off in my head. I was meeting with the director, Rivka Sass. We were having coffee, just shooting the breeze one day, and she mentioned the iStreet Press, and I mentioned my book, and I think we both thought, hey, this might be a good fit for the iStreet Press. And the more I realized it, I thought this is the perfect fit, because the iStreet Press really is all about giving the community an opportunity to pull its stories together and tell its stories, whether it's a family story, a business story, some book of poetry, fiction, what have you. It's a reflection of the community. And I thought this book of mine, 2/3 of it are all about Sacramento. So if I could somehow help promote the iStreet Press and help promote the Sacramento Public Library and get this book published in the same time, in the same breath, well, it'd be a win all around. So to me, the iStreet Press, I didn't have to hear any more than that. I just said, let's go with the iStreet Press, let's do it, let's get this thing going. And it's been a delight. I mean, an absolute joy working with the iStreet Press and the Sacramento Public Library.
Oh, good to hear. Okay, so back to the Kings. You mentioned all of the Rochester, Cincinnati, Kansas City, Omaha, all of these cities where the Vagrant Kings have gone, and one thing they have in common is they're all sort of second-tier, marginal professional sports markets. Any lessons that, as a Sacramentan, we can kind of draw from how you sort of stay in the game as a secondary market, when it's worth it to stay in the game, what we kind of need to know.
Yeah, and I'll take a bit of an exception to part of your question, and not speaking as someone who lives in Kansas City or Cincinnati. But those cities are a little bit different in that they do have, Kansas City and Cincinnati both have NFL teams. Certainly Cincinnati.
But they're among the smallest NFL markets.
You're absolutely right. They also have Major League Baseball teams. And in both towns, what's interesting is when the Kings left Cincinnati and when they left Kansas City, nobody cared. And I'm exaggerating. I mean, obviously a few thousand people cared, but very,
well,
very
and those
few.
are also cities that aren't necessarily overshadowed by their immediate neighbors the way we are by the Bay Area and to a lesser extent Los Angeles.
Exactly. So the what I found was interesting, that was most interesting, was when you look at those cities, the Kings leave, there's barely a ripple when they do leave, and the NBA never comes back to those cities. The NBA is done with, well, it never came back to Rochester, and Rochester's too small to support a major league team now. But they never went back to Cincinnati. They never went back to Kansas City. So that kind of tells you something, that maybe the NBA found its niche somewhere else other than in those places. And maybe those communities had other things to do with their time and money rather than spend it on the NBA. So I don't know if the parallel is there, but I'll tell you what, I think if Sacramento were to lose the Kings, we would be similar to those cities in that we'd never get another NBA team. And I don't think we're going to get NFL, because we got 2 NFL teams right down the road in San Francisco and in Oakland, of course. And I know we're not going to get a baseball team, because baseball controls where teams move, and there's 2 teams in the Bay, and they're not going to put a 3rd team in Northern California. So
personally, I'm excited about the idea of getting an MLS team.
Well, you and me both.
Yeah,
you and me both.
I think we'd be perfect for that.
You and me both, and I would too. In fact, when I was at the mayor's office, we were working a little bit on that. Because I think that's the future, frankly. Not to get off topic, but I think the MLS is the place to go. But again, Sacramento's unique because it's such a small market. It's smaller than those markets in terms of its sports offerings, and I think that's one reason why we fell so hard for these Vagrant Kings. We fell in love with them, whereas these other cities could kind of take them or leave them. Sacramento fell in love with its Kings, and I think we'll love them forever.
Was that part of why Stern wanted to keep him here, or how much of the story is that, and how much of it is other things?
I think I think a lot of it is that. I think a lot of it is David. And I can't climb inside of his head. And I've spent a lot of time around the guy. He's brilliant. He is. I think he's the best commissioner in the history of sports. I'll put him up there ahead of Pete Rozelle, which some people think is insane, but so be it. I think he's great. I mean, he's been a fabulous commissioner. Certainly, there's nobody that has been better to Sacramento than this guy, than David Stern. But I think he felt, I've got this little market that sort of nobody else cares about. They're vulnerable. They're fighting like hell to keep their team. And if I don't care about them and work for them, who will? And what good are we if we don't stand up for the little guy? And I think that was his approach. He said, these are the little guys. They need help, and I'm going to help them.
Well, there's definitely an impression, and I think this is backed up by your book, that Stern was very instrumental in keeping the Kings here. And I mean, when you're talking about Sacramento, the other side of that coin is the folks who really went to the wall to try to get the Kings were Seattle. They had lost their team. There's an ownership group there. They had sort of a different approach to public financing. And then, at certain points, they kind of got involved in Sacramento politics, too, which I think a lot of people don't necessarily know about. So get into some of that.
And that's all true. They did. Let's back up a bit, though. Seattle is a town that lost its NBA team. So we all get that. The team moved to Oklahoma City. There was some acrimony between the city and the ownership. There's some fans that are mad at the ownership, et cetera. But why did they really want the Kings? I mean, that's where I start from. They have the NFL, they have professional Major League Baseball, they have professional soccer, top flight. They sell the place out, and they have a top tier college team, the UW, University of Washington. So they have more sports up there than we can imagine in Sacramento. Now, you add the Kings to that mix, the Kings are going to be the 4th or 5th buy, frankly. Mm-hmm. They are. And I don't care, unless they're winning championships, which they haven't done since 1951. They're going to be the 4th or 5th buy. So I think that Steve Ballmer and his friend Mr. Hansen, Chris Hansen, I think they bought the team or intended to buy the team for ego. I think it was just pure ego. There might have been a real estate play up there. I'm not sure about that, because I don't work there and haven't lived there. But I think it was pure ego. And I think Stern realized that. And of course a lot of people in Seattle claim that Stern just has an axe to grind with Seattle. I don't believe that. I can tell you for a fact, Seattle people may argue with this, but for a fact, the political and community support has never been there in Seattle for the NBA the way it is in Sacramento. It's apples and oranges. So to me, it's an easy sell for David Stern. And plus they want to protect an incumbent city. David Stern hates relocations, doesn't want teams to move around. It's a sign of instability. It's not a sign of, and it hurts the credibility of the league, frankly. So I think David Stern wants the team to stay put. He's got this town that loves its team. He's got this other city that may or may not want him, but they've got some wealthy guys that can afford to get a play toy, write a blank check. Let's give Sacramento a chance. That's what happened.
Well, I mean, there's also a lot of talk, though, that David Stern chose the city that was putting up a lot of public money, being Sacramento, over the city that was going to put up a lot of private money, Seattle.
Yeah, and I don't know if it breaks down quite that clearly, because there was talk about public money in in Seattle as well. Now, the caveat was that money would be paid back, but we never saw how the plan would really work. I mean, there are some, I've read the documents that the City Council approved up there, but we never saw that plan in action. So, but there was a component of public money, certainly in that with the Seattle play. There may not have been quite as much as you find in Sacramento, but again, I don't think that was the real issue. I think the real issue was more, I think Stern really wanted to protect this market, because remember, he was appointed commissioner in '84 and the Kings moved in '85. He's leaving as commissioner in February of 2014. I don't think he wanted to see his career, which is sort of mirrored the Sacramento Kings. I don't think he wanted to
with more success.
Well, a good deal more success, right, to say the least. But I don't think he wanted his time as commissioner to end on the note of the team that he ushered into the league, so to speak, in Sacramento, now leaving Sacramento as he retires. I don't think it's the public money issue, even though public money, of course, is a huge piece here. It would be a significant piece in Seattle as well.
Okay, well, and since we're, I'd like to end, I guess, with, sort of the future of Sacramento and the Kings. Obviously, there's been a lot of love for the Kings and people wanting to keep the Kings here. I mean, in fact, outside the library today, there was some guy out there with a bunch of Kings signs. I didn't actually have a chance to stop and ask what it was about, but there's that. But then on the going through this for really, it seems like it's been going on for years, and kind of hit a fever pitch more recently. You also got to wonder, has that hurt the Kings brand in Sacramento a little bit? Some of this controversy, some of the ill feelings about the Maloofs, so they're out of the picture now. Some of the feelings about the public money that was put up.
Yeah, I think it has. Without question, it has. You'll notice that now that there's new ownership in the Kings front office, they're still struggling to make people believe in them, and that they're struggling to fill the building. They filled it for opening night. They filled it for. They may or may not have filled it for the second night, but. After that, it's going to be tough to fill that building, and that's all. There's two factors there. Number one, the team's bad. I mean, people don't want to pay money for a bad team. They never have, never will. But there's a bad taste left by the Maloofs. Even though they're gone, even though they're out of town, out of the picture, I think people are still reluctant to get involved with the Kings. Many people are. As much as they love the team and want it to stay, they're not going to start writing checks immediately. I think they want to see that these guys mean what they say, these new guys mean what they say, and are really the real deal. I think they are, but I think time will tell.
Oh, very good. Well, that covers my questions. Well, thank you very much for joining us here at the Sacramento Public Library and the I Street Press.
It's my pleasure, Malcolm. Thank you.